Margaret Holloway opened her front door to the patch that had buried her son and said, "Come in before the cold kills you." The wind shoved knives of snow through the porch slats and rattled the chains on the old swing as 15 figures loomed out of the white, helmets slick with ice, leather stiff with frost, engines coughing like wounded animals in the road. She stood in her wool cardigan like a fortress made of kindness, a 72-year-old widow bracing her shoulder against the storm, while a tree line of chrome and muscle waited for her permission to cross the threshold. And though every neighbor in the valley would later say she had lost her mind, she knew the exact mathematics of suffering and warmth, and that the only thing worse than letting them in would be remembering that she did not. The first rider removed his helmet, and steam rose off his hair as if the storm were boiling him alive. His eyes winter gray and searching, the kind of gaze that had read prison walls and emergency rooms and long stretches of highway that never ended where a man hoped they would. He introduced himself as Ryder, and the name fit like a scar that had learned to speak. Behind him the others shifted and stomped and breathed hard, a tribe in exile, and over the snowbanks she could see the stranded van with its hood open, white breath lifting from the radiator, the stranded tail of their convoy bobbing its red lights in the whiteout. Margaret's hand did not tremble as she pushed the door wide, and the heat of her small farmhouse rolled out like a mercy, the smell of beef stew and wood smoke catching the men unguarded, pulling their shoulders down from around their ears, reminding them that somewhere in America soup still meant survival. "Leave the boots on the rag by the stove and hang the leathers on the chairbacks," she said, and her voice carried the iron of a schoolteacher and the softness of the woman who kept a box of biscuits on the porch for strays. Snow hissed where it hit the fire grate, dripping into embers that popped inside. Wet leather creaked. Gloves slapped the rough wood of the table. A man with a biker's laugh that had forgotten how to laugh muttered that he was not used to being invited anywhere, and another whose knuckles were tattooed like graves whispered thanks as if gratitude might break if he raised it above a hush. The kitchen gathered them in a circle that felt old and human, a ring around the stove like settlers around a wagon fire, and yet danger sat beside them like a silent guest. The patches on their jackets said Hell's Angels, and the stories the valley told about such men had been growing for years like weeds in the mouth of a well, choking the water but never changing the thirst. Margaret ladled stew with a steady wrist, meeting every gaze and finding not monsters but exhausted men with wind-burned faces, and the strict posture of people who had slept on concrete and learned to sit straight, just to keep the spine awake. The spoon clinked the pot, the bowls knocked the table. The first mouthfuls came with a low sound that did not belong to language, and when Ryder took his bowl, he noticed a faded photograph in a frame near the stove. A young man in dress blue shaking hands with a general, a grin like sunrise, and next to it another photograph in an antique silver frame. The same young man standing beside a motorcycle under summer light. Margaret saw Ryder see the pictures, and for a second she wanted to shield them with her body. But the impulse passed through her like a wind through a stand of pines that refuses to bow. "My husband served," she said, "and my boy loved the open road." A rider with frostbitten cheeks warmed his hands on the bowl and said that the road loved him back until it did not, and one or two nodded with that small, private flinch men share when a memory steps out of the dark. Margaret poured coffee as if she were pouring truce, her kettle trembling slightly when the back door banged under a gust, and she slid a kettle cozy into place like a mother tucking in a child. 15 heavy shapes filled the small room, shoulders bumping, boots squeaking on melted snow, steam fogging the window panes until the outside world vanished. And in that temporary blindness the farmhouse became a ship adrift in a polar sea, its hull the old timber bones of her husband's hands, its captain a woman who had learned that grief can steer better than fear. When the generator coughed and lights dimmed, the men reached almost in unison toward the flashlights on their belts. But Margaret had already struck a match, the flame quick as decision, and she lit a mason jar candle on the table, then another on the counter, then one in the hall where the cold pressed like a burglar against the door seams, and with each small light the room grew steady again. She set a bowl on a tray and moved to the den where the oldest rider had slumped, his lips going blue at the edges, and she checked his hands with the calm of someone who had once learned triage over a radio, while waiting for the school bus to arrive with a child who did not. A towel, a bucket, warm water, careful rubbing, the slow return of pink and feeling, the sigh that rose from the man like a prayer he had not said in years, and Margaret found the degree of warmth that gives life back without burning the way back in. "Ma'am," Ryder said, and the room stilled in respect at the single word. "We won't forget this." "You better not," she answered, and a thin smile moved across her face, not a surrendering smile but a soldier's, the kind a woman wears when the artillery has finally fallen quiet. Snow drove itself against the windows, thick as wool, and up the road the van sat dead and half buried, and further still the line of bikes hunched under the pines like animals waiting out a predator. She walked to the hallway and pulled an extra quilt from the linen chest and another from the cedar hope chest that had not been opened since her husband's funeral, and she spread them across shoulders so broad they made the quilts look small, and as she did she heard the old floorboards groan the way the human heart does when it makes room for something it never expected to carry. On the mantel, the photograph of her son shimmered with the candle flame, and for an instant it looked as if he blinked in the heat, the grin warming, the motorcycle gloss becoming liquid, the summer sun alive in glass, and an ache rose in her that could have drowned a lesser woman. She pressed it down with the discipline of a person who has spent entire nights alone with memory and refused to let it call the shots. And she turned back to the kitchen and her guests and saw what no one else would have recognized in that moment, that the storm outside was not the only storm gathered at her door. The men were thawing, but something colder than weather stalked their eyes. A history of debts and injuries and promises, and although the house felt safe, a thread ran through it like a tripwire, waiting for a step no one could yet see. Margaret handed Ryder a second bowl of stew and told him the spare room was warm and the sofa had good springs, and that the house had rules. No shouting, no drink, no violence, and that if any man stepped out of line, the old shotgun above the mantel was not decoration. He held her gaze, measured her steel, and nodded like a soldier accepts command. The storm howled, the clock ticked, the fire breathed, and in the fragile space between a woman's courage and a crew of hardened men, there opened a quiet that felt like the first plank laid toward an impossible bridge. By midnight, the storm had grown into something biblical. The wind screamed through the chimney like a living thing, and snow hammered the old farmhouse with a fury that felt personal. Inside, 15 men who had lived their whole lives on the edge of danger sat around a woman whose calm defied every rule of survival they knew. Margaret Holloway moved between them like a conductor among instruments, her steps slow, steady, precise, as if she'd been hosting lost souls all her life. Ryder sat nearest the fire, one arm resting on the back of his chair, his other hand absently tracing the worn handle of a knife holstered at his belt. His eyes kept drifting toward the photographs on the mantelpiece. The soldier, the motorcycle, the young man whose grin seemed to belong to a different world. He had seen that kind of light once before, in someone who'd died young. Something about that photo gnawed at him, a memory brushing against the edges of recognition. Margaret noticed the way he looked at the picture, the shadow that moved across his face. She didn't speak of it. She had learned long ago that when people carry ghosts, you don't chase them. You just make enough quiet space for them to breathe. She placed a cup of tea beside him, her hand steady despite the tension that vibrated through the room like a wire pulled too tight. Across the table, one of the younger bikers, a thin man with trembling hands and haunted eyes, whispered something under his breath. Another shushed him. The room stiffened. Margaret caught the glance they shared. Something had passed between them that wasn't about weather or warmth. "A secret, you men out of Red Falls?" she asked lightly as if to break the silence. Ryder's head lifted. "Started there, yeah. Ride mostly west now," she nodded. "My son used to ride out that way before the accident." The men shifted, eyes lowering to their bowls. Even the storm seemed to pause for a breath. Ryder leaned forward. "What happened?" She stirred the fire with the poker, watching sparks leap like fireflies. "He loved his bike more than sense. Went out one night in the rain. Never came home." The quiet stretched long. Ryder's jaw tightened, his hand still on the knife handle. "I'm sorry," he said. And for once it wasn't just words. "Thank you," she said softly, her eyes catching his for a brief electric second. There was something in that look, an awareness, a recognition that neither could name. The night thickened around them. Somewhere in the back room a floorboard creaked. One of the men muttered that they should have kept moving, storm or not. Another said they'd have frozen. Their voices rose, low and tense, until Ryder's bark cut through them. "Sit down." She took us in. "You act like guests or you sleep in the snow." The discipline was instant. It was the kind of tone that came from command, not fear. Margaret watched him, the natural authority, the exhaustion underneath, and wondered what kind of man he had been before the road swallowed him. When she turned back to refill the kettle, she caught sight of something that stopped her cold. One of the men, older, with a jagged scar across his temple, was staring at her son's picture. His face had gone pale, his lips parted as if he'd seen a ghost. Then quietly he stood and walked to the window, turning his back to everyone. Margaret's pulse quickened. The air shifted again. Later, when the others had dozed by the fire, she saw that same man alone in the hallway. He was whispering a name under his breath, a name that froze her where she stood. "Michael," he said, barely audible, his voice cracking under the weight of memory. Margaret's world tilted. For a heartbeat, she thought she'd misheard, but when he turned and saw her standing there, his eyes widened, and she saw in them the truth that her soul had dreaded for years. He knew her son. He opened his mouth to speak, but Ryder appeared behind him, his shadow falling long across the hallway. "Get some sleep," Ryder ordered, the words sharp enough to end any confession. The man hesitated, then walked past without a glance. Margaret met Ryder's gaze. "What did he mean by that name?" she asked quietly. Ryder's expression gave nothing away. "Don't know," he said. "But I'll find out." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe these men were only travelers caught in a storm. But as she turned off the lamp, she couldn't shake the feeling that fate hadn't sent them to her door for warmth. It had sent them for judgment. Outside, the snow fell thicker, muting the world in white silence. Inside, under the flicker of dying firelight, a secret smoldered, one that would burn its way through every heart in that house before dawn. The house had settled into that eerie stillness that only comes after too much talk. Too much warmth, too much truth trying to hide beneath it all. The storm had won. It buried the van completely, sealed the road, and turned the world outside into a white tomb. Inside, the farmhouse glowed in candlelight and low fire, the air thick with the scent of stew, wet leather, and something older, the ache of buried memories clawing their way back to life. Margaret couldn't sleep. She stood at the window, watching snow swallow her garden, her reflection floating faintly over the black glass. Behind her, the sound of snoring rose and fell from the living room where the men had made camp on couches and rugs, wrapped in her quilts like sons she never had the chance to raise. Yet among the rhythm of breathing, she could hear one voice, and murmuring, low, restless, haunted. It was the scarred man, the one who had whispered her son's name. She turned toward the sound and stepped lightly across the creaking floorboards. He lay half awake, eyes glinting under the dim glow, his lips moving around fragments of words she couldn't quite catch. Names, places, a date, then clearer like a knife through cloth, Bridge Road. 21. The crash, Margaret's breath hitched. Bridge Road, the curve where Michael had died. The words crashed through her chest like thunder. She pressed a hand over her heart, steadying herself against the doorway. Couldn't stop. He muttered again, voice thick with pain. Didn't see him till too late. Margaret stepped closer, her heart hammering so loud she feared it might wake the house. "What did you say?" The man jolted upright, eyes wild. For a second he looked ready to fight, then realized who stood before him. He froze. "Ma'am," he said, voice rasped raw. "I didn't mean—" "Bridge Road," she said quietly, her tone trembling between fury and disbelief. "You said Bridge Road." He swallowed hard, guilt etched into every scar. "That was a long time ago. A mistake. I didn't know—" Ryder's voice came sharp from the shadows. "That's enough." Both turned toward the sound. Ryder stood at the edge of the room, shoulders filling the doorway, his face caught half in firelight, half in dark. The silence that followed was thick, dangerous. "Tell her," Margaret demanded, voice breaking with years of suppressed grief. "Tell me what you know about my son." The scarred man's hand shook. "I wasn't the one who hit him. It was my brother. I was behind him. I saw the whole thing. We were just kids then, dumb, full of beer and speed." He swerved to avoid a deer. "Your boy came around the bend, and by the time we stopped, it was too late." Margaret's legs weakened. She sank into the armchair, her breath shallow. The man's confession hung in the air, heavy as the snow outside. Ryder stepped forward, jaw tight. "I told you to keep that shut," he said to the man. "You knew?" Margaret's voice was soft, stunned. Ryder hesitated. "Not until tonight. He told me when we stopped at the diner before the storm. I didn't want to bring it here. Didn't want to bring that to your door. Margaret's hands trembled. And yet here you are. Ryder knelt, his voice lowering. We didn't come to hurt you. We didn't even know whose house this was. But when I saw that photo, his voice trailed off. Your son. He had that same look. Brave. Free. Reckless. Tears burned her eyes, but anger kept them from falling. You ride the same roads that killed him. You wear the same colors that took him from me. And yet I fed you. Ryder met her gaze, something like shame flickering behind the steel. And you saved us. You could have slammed that door. Most people would have. I should have, she whispered. No, he said softly. You shouldn't have. Because none of us have seen mercy in a long damn time. Maybe that's why the storm pushed us here. The words hung between them. Mercy, storm, fate, all too big to hold, all too heavy to deny. The scarred man stood slowly, his eyes wet. If I could trade places with your boy, I would. I've been paying for that night every mile since. Margaret's lips trembled, caught between rage and pity. Then don't waste it, she said, voice steadying. If you walk out of here tomorrow, you make sure his name meant something. He nodded, broken, and turned away. Ryder exhaled, slow and deep, as if something inside him cracked open. You have my word, ma'am. What happens from this night? Forward, it won't be forgotten, Margaret. Looked from him to the photograph. Above the mantel, her son's eternal grin flickering in the firelight. And for the first time in years, she didn't know whether the ache in her chest was grief or forgiveness trying to find its way through. Outside, the storm began to ease, but inside the house, the real storm of truth, guilt, and redemption had only just begun to rage. By dawn, the storm had surrendered. The wind fell quiet, the air held its breath, and the snow stretched across the valley like a white burial shroud. The farmhouse stood half buried, its windows rimmed with frost, its chimney breathing slow curls of smoke into a sky so pale it looked bruised. Margaret hadn't slept. Neither had Ryder. The men stirred in silence, their earlier bravado melted down to something raw and uncertain. The confession from the night before had spread among them like spilled kerosene. Silent, dangerous, waiting for a spark. The scarred man avoided everyone's gaze. He sat apart, his hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, eyes red from more than lack of sleep. Ryder leaned against the counter, arms crossed, the leader caught between loyalty and the faint, terrible feeling that last night had shifted something none of them could fix. When Margaret came in from the back room, hair tied in a gray braid, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, the men stood without thinking, not out of fear, but respect. Something about her demanded it. You've got clear skies now, she said quietly. Road'll open by noon. Ryder nodded, but he didn't move. We'll clean up first. Can't leave this place looking like a pack of wolves passed through. Margaret almost smiled. I've dealt with worse. As the men set to work stacking firewood, scraping snow from the porch, and patching the van's broken radiator, the house filled with the steady rhythm of repair. But beneath the hum of movement, something darker coiled. Margaret could feel it, like a storm lingering underground. When she stepped outside to shake a rug, she found fresh tracks in the snow, boot prints leading away from the barn toward the woods. She frowned. One pair only, too early for a walk, too cold. She followed them partway down the slope until she saw it. A flash of black leather slumped against a tree. It was the scarred man. His jacket was open, steam rising faintly from his body. A revolver lay half buried in the snow beside him. Margaret's breath caught. She ran to him, knees crunching through the frost. No, no, you fool. She knelt, pressing trembling fingers to his neck. Warmth. A pulse. Faint but there. He groaned, eyelids fluttering. Why? She whispered, choking on the wind. He turned his head weakly. Couldn't carry it anymore, he rasped. Didn't want to face you when the sun came up. Margaret's tears burned her cheeks. You think dying fixes it? That's not repentance. That's escape. He coughed, blood spotting the snow. Tell Ryder. I'm sorry. Tell him. His voice trailed off, swallowed by the wind. Margaret's voice broke. Stay with me! But he was already gone. By the time Ryder reached the woods, he knew. He saw the old woman kneeling beside the body, her cardigan stained with red, her face set in that quiet, terrible stillness that comes after shock. "God, no," he muttered, falling to his knees beside her. "He shot himself," she said flatly. "Coward's way out." Ryder's face twisted. He wasn't a coward. He was broken. "Broken men fix things," she snapped, her grief slicing through her control. "They don't leave more bodies behind." He didn't argue. He just stared at the lifeless figure, his oldest friend, his brother in every way except blood, and something hardened in his gaze. "We'll take care of him proper," he said. "He'll get a burial. Not out here like an animal." Margaret stood, snow clinging to her skirt. "You'll bury him behind the barn. The ground's softest there." Ryder looked up, confused. "You'd allow that?" Her jaw trembled. "My husband's grave is out front. My son's ashes are under that oak. Seems fitting to keep all the lost men in one place." For a long moment, Ryder just stared at her. This frail, iron woman who somehow carried more mercy than he'd seen in any church or courtroom. "You're something else, Mrs. Holloway," he murmured. She turned away. "No, just tired of hate." They dug through the morning, the men silent, the scrape of shovels and the occasional sniffle the only sounds. When they lowered the body into the shallow grave, Margaret whispered a single line of prayer, not for his soul, but for the one still living. When it was done, the men lined their bikes along the snowy drive, engines coughing to life. Ryder lingered by the porch. "You'll never see us again," he said quietly. "I hope I do," she replied. "If only to know you kept your word." He paused, confusion flickering in his eyes. "Word?" She looked at him steadily. "That what happens from this night forward won't be forgotten." Ryder nodded once solemnly, then mounted his bike. The engines roared. Snow sprayed. The convoy rolled down the road like a column of ghosts disappearing into white daylight. Margaret stood on the porch long after the sound faded. Then she noticed something strange. A folded piece of paper wedged beneath the doorframe. She unfolded it with trembling fingers. It was a photograph. Her son Michael standing beside another young man, a teenage rider, both laughing, arms slung around each other, matching bikes gleaming behind them. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, "Brothers of the Road, 1997. Margaret's knees went weak. She gripped the railing, the wind cutting through her breath. Ryder had known her son all along. The truth hit her like the final gust of the dying storm. And somewhere down the road, Ryder's head turned as if he felt her eyes burning through the snow. Dawn arrived like a wound reopening. The wind had stopped, but the silence was heavier than the storm itself, pressing down on the farmhouse until even the floorboards seemed to listen. The snow outside lay smooth and merciless, a white sea burying every tire track and footprint from the night before. Inside, the fire had burned itself into a dull red heart, and the air smelled of ashes and cold coffee. Margaret stood at the sink, staring at her reflection in the window pane. Her eyes were swollen from a night without sleep, yet her posture was unbroken. Behind her, the bikers stirred, their voices low, the creak of leather and clink of metal softer than prayer. The house that had echoed with conversation hours earlier was now filled with the hush of men who had seen too much. The scarred man's confession had peeled away every layer of pretense. Now only guilt and fatigue remained. Ryder stepped out of the hallway, his boots thudding on the boards. His jaw was set, his eyes rimmed in shadow. "We'll be gone soon as the van's ready," he said. "Didn't mean to bring trouble into your home." Margaret didn't turn. "Trouble doesn't need an invitation," she murmured. "It knows where people live." He wanted to answer but couldn't. The way she said it, half warning, half forgiveness, made his throat tighten. Around them, the other riders moved with the solemn care of mourners, wiping down tables, stacking wood, patching the radiator they had torn apart in the storm. It was an army of men trying to erase the evidence of their own salvation. When the generator sputtered to life and light filled the kitchen, Margaret's gaze fell on something glinting beneath the window, a small metal keychain shaped like a winged skull. She picked it up, frowning. "This yours?" she asked. Ryder's eyes darkened. "Used to be." He took it, thumb brushing the engraving. MH, her breath caught. "Those initials, Michael Holloway," he said before he could stop himself. Then, realizing what he'd said, he closed his hand around it. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut skin. Margaret's voice came out thin but steady. You knew my boy. Ryder didn't look at her. Long time ago. Before the club, before all this. He rode with us one summer. We were just kids chasing freedom. Her hands trembled against the counter. He never told me that. He wouldn't have, Ryder said quietly. We weren't angels then either. He was different, smart, fearless, always talking about building something better. Said the road was the only place he could think straight. His eyes lifted, wet now. He saved my life once. Pulled me out after a crash in Nevada. I owe him everything. Margaret's world tilted. The faces of the past rearranged themselves. Her son laughing at the door, the roar of his bike fading into dusk. Her last words to him, be careful. And now, standing in her kitchen, was the man he had once called brother. The sound of boots outside broke the moment. One of the riders burst in, breathless. Ryder, come quick. It's Kane. They ran to the barn. The door hung open, snow piled inside, and beside the woodpile lay Kane, the scarred man, his skin gray, a revolver loose in his hand. A crimson bloom spread across his jacket. Margaret dropped to her knees, pressing 2 fingers to his throat. A faint pulse fluttered, then faded. She looked up at Ryder, her voice shaking. He's gone. Ryder knelt, fists digging into the snow. He couldn't face it, he whispered. He thought dying would even the score. Margaret's tears fell freely now, steaming where they hit the snow. There is no even. There never is. They buried Kane behind the barn, the ground frozen stiff. The men worked without speaking, the scrape of shovels echoing against the trees. Margaret stood over the shallow grave and whispered the same words she had spoken over her husband years ago. Let the lost find warmth. When it was done, Ryder brushed the dirt from his gloves. We'll leave you in peace, he said. Margaret's eyes met his. Peace isn't something you leave, she answered. It's something you take with you or you don't. He nodded once and turned toward the van. Engines growled to life, exhaust curling in the pale air. The convoy rolled down the road, shrinking into a line of black dots against endless white. Margaret watched until they vanished, then turned to go inside. Something on the porch caught her eye, an envelope weighted by a single spent shell. She picked it up, heart pounding, and slid out the paper within. It was an old photograph. Michael laughing beside a younger rider, their arms slung around each other, matching bikes gleaming in the sun. On the back, scrawled in shaky handwriting, for the mother who still forgives. Her breath hitched. The world tilted again. Ryder had known from the moment he stepped through her door. He hadn't been seeking shelter from the storm. He'd been seeking absolution. Margaret sank onto the porch step, snow melting beneath her palms, and whispered into the wind, then let it begin. Down the valley, faint and distant, came the echo of engines turning back. The storm was over, but something far larger was riding toward her. The spring thaw came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it felt like the world exhaling. The snow melted from the fields in slow rivulets, carving silver veins across the brown earth. Margaret Holloway's farmhouse stood stubborn and whole, its porch newly mended, the fence freshly painted by hands that had promised to return, and had kept that promise. The memory of the storm still lived in the wood and the walls like a heartbeat beneath the plaster. It had been 3 months since that night, and the town still whispered about it. They said the Hells Angels had been hiding from the law, that the old widow had tamed them with soup and sermons, that they buried one of their own behind her barn and never spoke his name again. But Margaret knew the truth, or at least enough of it to keep the rest sacred. She visited the grave every morning, brushing snow or leaves away, whispering the same words, find peace where the road can't reach. One gray morning, as she poured coffee and looked out toward the melting road, the sound came again in a low distant rumble like thunder returning from the dead. She froze, mug halfway to her lips. Within minutes the rumble grew into a roar. Then the first bike appeared, black and gleaming, followed by another and another. By the time she stepped out onto the porch, the horizon was alive with chrome and color, row after row of motorcycles stretching down the road, their riders wearing black leather jackets emblazoned with wings and skulls. Her heart trembled, but not from fear. 100 bikes at least, lined up with the precision of soldiers. At their head stood Ryder, helmet under his arm, his face rougher, older somehow, but steadier too. Behind him, the riders dismounted in unison. They carried boxes, tools, bundles of wood, sacks of flour, jars of jam, offerings of gratitude and repair. Mrs. Holloway, Ryder called, his voice carrying over the engines. We came to finish what we started. Margaret descended the porch steps slowly, her cardigan flapping in the wind. You didn't have to. We did, Ryder said, his eyes shining. After Kane, after that night, something changed. Word spread across chapters. Men who hadn't spoken in years showed up. They said if mercy could live in one woman's heart, maybe it could live in ours too. The others nodded, silent but reverent. One by one they began unloading. Some rebuilt her barn roof. Others tilled the frozen garden. 2 patched her picket fence. No one spoke much. They worked like men in a holy ritual. Margaret stood among them, her heart aching with a strange, radiant warmth. When the work was done, Ryder approached with a small wooden cross. The wood was polished, carved with careful hands. He planted it beside Kane's grave, pressing the soil firm around its base. Then he stepped back, motioning for her to read the inscription. In memory of Michael Holloway, a mother's mercy saves more than vengeance ever will. Her knees weakened. She reached out, tracing the words with trembling fingers. You remembered him, Ryder's voice cracked. He remembered me first. She looked up sharply. What do you mean? Ryder swallowed hard. Before he died? I wasn't just his friend. I was the one who taught him to ride. The one who talked him into joining a run that night. His voice wavered. I wasn't behind the wheel that hit him, but I was the reason he was there. The one who called him out into the rain. The confession struck her like lightning, but not the kind that destroys. The kind that illuminates everything hidden in the dark. Margaret's tears spilled freely now, her hands clutching the wooden cross. You carried that weight all these years? Ryder nodded. Every mile. Every road. I thought if I rode far enough, fast enough, I could outpace it. But I couldn't. He looked at her, eyes full of guilt and something deeper, yearning for forgiveness. That night in the storm, when I saw your son's photo on the mantel, I thought God was mocking me. But you let me in anyway. You saved me before you knew who I was. Margaret's breath trembled. And now I do. She reached up, cupping his face with both hands, the way she used to hold her son when he came home bruised from fights. We can't choose who we save, Ryder, but maybe that's the point. Grace isn't earned. It's given. Ryder's eyes glistened. He knelt before her, pressing his forehead to the back of her hand. I don't deserve it. No one ever does, she whispered. The other riders stood in silence, heads bowed, engines idling softly like a heartbeat of gratitude. Then Ryder rose, slipping something from his jacket pocket, a dog tag tarnished and bent. He placed it in her palm. Michael gave me this the day we parted ways. Said I'd know when to bring it back. Margaret's tears fell onto the metal, cleaning the years from it. He was right, she said. They stood together in the still air, the wind rustling through the trees, the faint sound of engines humming like a hymn. When the riders mounted their bikes again, Ryder lingered last. We'll check in from time to time if that's all right, he said. Margaret smiled faintly. You do that, and if the road ever tries to swallow you again, you know where home is. Ryder hesitated, then leaned down and kissed her forehead. Goodbye, Mother Holloway. As the convoy rolled away, 100 engines thundered across the valley, not as a warning this time, but as a promise. Margaret watched them disappear into the sunlight, her heart both lighter and heavier than ever before. When the last echo faded, she looked at the cross, at the farmhouse, at the sky. The pain was still there, but it no longer ruled her. It had transformed, from wound to wisdom, from loss to love. She whispered into the soft wind. The world took my son, but it gave me 100 others. Maybe that's how heaven works. It doesn't give back what you lost. It just teaches you how to keep loving anyway.